As the title says, we're looking at vagrant orchids in New Zealand, how they got here and how they're doing. First of all, we need to talk about the orchids in New Zealand. Currently, there are about 127 recognised species. Now, 9 of them are epiphytic and the remainder of them terrestrial. There are 15 indeterminate taxa recognised by botanists associated with DOC. Of the 127 species, 37 are either threatened or at risk. Now, there are also numerous other tag name taxa that have been found over the past few years that may warrant further investigation. New Zealand shares about 40% of its orchid species with Australia. A lot of them have been here for centuries or millennia, but a few, what we're going to be talking about, these are the vagrants and the colonizers that have arrived in more recent times. As I said earlier, we have some threatened species, and of these nationally threatened, 2 of them are of interest to us tonight. That's Caleana minor and the Thelymitra matthewsii. Now, what we're talking about, as I said, the non-resident native species. We've got vagrants. Now, they can naturally arrive, but they don't have long-term sustainable populations, usually because the pollinator that they are dependent on has not arrived with them. Now, there are 4 here that we're going to be looking at tonight. 2 of them, Chiloglottis formicifera and Pterostylis nutans, are either extinct or very, very likely to be extinct again shortly here in New Zealand. And of course, we've also got the colonizers. These are ones that have made the jump across the Tasman and have managed to set up a resident breeding population. Either, in this case, their pollinators come with them, or they found a pollinator here in New Zealand that is doing the same job as pollinators in Australia, or they may be self-pollinating. And again, we've got 4 that we're going to be looking at. Now, of course, where do they come from? I've pulled up some data from the Australasian virtual herbarium that I will be interspersing some of my slides with to show you exactly, well, where their collections have come from in the herbarium. But basically, the area that we're going to be looking at is around this area mainly, with the main area actually being centred Tasmania, Melbourne, and into a bit of New South Wales. One of the ways we believe that they get to New Zealand is that orchid seed, being very light, can get lift up into the higher altitudes when there's a good wind running, and also when there are events like some of your bushfires that cause uplift in the environment. And if they occur while the orchids are seeding, there's a possibility that seeds will be lifted up into the stratosphere and carried over to New Zealand with this westward drift. Now, if you look here, you can see around Antarctica, the wind spirals westward and it comes up through here over to New Zealand. And that is one of the ways that it's thought that the orchids are getting across. There are other ways that they may be coming on the feet of some of the birds that cross the Tasman Sea. There's also the possibility that some of them have been introduced by human intervention as well, accidentally. So we'll actually start off this part of the talk here in the centre of the North Island, a place called Iwatahi. Iwatahi is the site of a exotic timber nursery which had been set up during the Depression. This is in the Central Plateau. Amongst other trees that they were looking at was eucalypt species to look at them as a possibility as plantation trees. And the Kaingaroa forest was a huge plantation forest, mainly radiata, but also interspersed were blocks of Pinus nigra, Douglas fir, and a few other trees. There is a reserve of Pinus nigra near Taupo, which back in the 1980s and 90s, the Native Orchid Group pushed for the creation of the Heritage Protection Area because we found Chiloglottis was Gunnii at the time, now called Valida. And when they had a look around the area, we found quite a number of other species of orchids growing. And currently there are approximately 35 species growing in this reserve, including, as I said, Valida and also Calochilus robertsonii, as you can see on the right here. Now, one of the interesting things about the Chiloglottis valida in the reserve is in some areas there is a high, by high I mean probably 2 or 3% of the flowers are showing signs of pollination, and we're wondering if this may be an indication of increasing autogamy or self-pollination, and similar to Chiloglottis cornuta, which valida is closely related to. Now, valida, as you can see, has got a distribution around the bottom of New South Wales into Victoria, some sites in Tasmania, and just, I believe, getting across the border into South Australia as well. And as you can see, the collection from Iwatahi showing up in the AVH Distribution Map. One of the shortfalls of the distribution map is that it only looks at herbarium specimens. So the Native Orchid Group has been doing a mapping program now for the past 30 years and have created distribution maps based on our data. We've basically looked and seen we haven't taken specimens for herbarium, so in the most part. And as you can see here, there is valida has been found down in Fiordland at the bottom of the South Island, up into towards the top of the South Island in Golden Bay, and just south of there, as well as in the central North Island. And there's a nice close-up of one of the validas here in New Zealand. As I said, also found at Iwatahi is Calochilus robertsonii, and you can see its wide distribution on the eastern seaboard of Australia, sweeping again round through Victoria and into South Australia. You'll also note that there is evidence of a collection in New Zealand right up in the far north. This was collected by one of the Matthews back in the early 1900s. But on the whole, the majority of Calochilus robertsonii is found in the central North Island. And as you can see on the distribution map here from the Native Orchid Group, there's also some found at the top of the South Island as well. A couple of close-up of robertsonii from Iwatahi. Now, one of the interesting things about Iwatahi, as I said, it was the centre for a exotic plantation trees nursery, and there was a large logging camp developed in the area as well as the forest developed. And come a weekend, the foresters wanted to have a bit of time away from camp, so quite often they would head north to Rotorua And one of the prime areas that they would head to is the racecourse there. And at the end of the day, whether they won or lost, they would tend to celebrate, then jump on the work bus to come back home. And at Waimonga here, we find Calochilus robertsonii. We also find it at the racecourse itself. It has come from Iwatahi. And the interesting thing about the Waimonga area is it's basically a bladder full distance from the racecourse. So we think that foresters who had been working, had got dressed up, had probably walked through some seeding Calochilus at Iwatahi, had taken the bus up to the racecourse, distributing seed there. Eventually it germinated, flowered, seeded, and they possibly picked them up again. And when they got off the bus to relieve themselves at Waimonga, they dropped more seed there, and that's why we've got another population there. So this plant here is actually flowering at Waimonga. It's in the pumice sand there. And here is a photo of one that's been flowering at the racecourse itself. So we've got the racecourse here, and just here at the thermal reserve, we have another very interesting orchid for New Zealanders at any rate, and that's Caleana minor. As you see, there's a very scattered distribution in New Zealand. There's a little bit around Rotorua, and again you see a collection up in the far north, again from the early 1900s by the Matthews family. On a good year at the site in Rotorua, you'll see a few scattered clumps like this of Caleana minor. It doesn't get to a lot of individuals. On a good year, there may be 40 or 50 flowering plants. On a bad year, there may be 2, 3, or maybe even none at all flowering. It's very variable, and the population has never really grown very much, but it has been stable over about 120 years since it was found in the area. Also in the central plateau area, as I said, we've got Pterostylis nutans. Currently, well, it was last seen about 8 years ago. There have been a few people back out into the area looking for it without success. So whether they're looking in the wrong area or not, I'm not sure, but its status here in New Zealand at the moment is a bit doubtful. As you can see, though, it has been collected again up towards the top of the North Island, up in Northland, and also down just below Auckland. So there's hope that if it has gone at the moment, it will come back. And this is a photo from the Central Plateau. I'm not sure how normal it is for nutans to be showing leaves looking quite that tatty when it's flowering. You'll be able to let me know once we get to the end of this talk. Another interesting plant at the top of the North Island is Thelymitra matthewsii. Now, I pointed out a couple of plants earlier on that had been shown to collections by the Matthews family, and this plant was actually collected by Matthews and named after him by one of our early orchidologists, Cheeseman. And this was in 1909. And the collection is actually the bottom of those dots that you can see there. This was around the site of a lake, which was noted at the time of collection to be in the process of being drained and turned into pasture. After this occurred, the plant was sort of lost for about 70 years until it was rediscovered in the 1980s, a bit further north at Te Paki. And as you can see, it's got a very scattered distribution as well in Australia. So it's quite a rare plant on both sides of the Tasman, I believe. And of course, it's interesting as it's the easternmost of the Thelymitra variegata complex. And I noted today that the ABC had just done a little piece on the Queen of Sheba Thelymitra variegata that's flowering currently over in WA. And here we have one of the plants in flower at Te Paki. It's growing close to and under Hakea in very sandy soil. And here we have a close-up of the flower. Another orchid that's jumped the ditch that's had an interesting time is Calochilus subulata. Again, it's found in the northern lowland lakes area at Kaimaumau, and it has got a nice distribution again over in Australia. The interesting thing about this plant was when it was first found here in New Zealand, a botanical illustrator, Digby Graham, went to make some drawings of it, and he's done some nice paintings, or did some nice paintings of it. And while he was doing so, he noticed a ichneumoniid wasp land on the flower and start to have its wicked way with it. And so he didn't know what it was. He managed to collect a sample and sent it down to Mount Albert, to the DSIR down there for identification. And it turned out that this wasp was the same wasp that was found over in Australia. But the interesting thing was, this was the first time this wasp had been found in New Zealand. So whether it had been blown here ahead of the orchid or it followed the orchid over somehow, but it's got here, and the orchid has been successfully colonizing the swampy areas around Kaimaumau in the top of Northland there. There's a nice close-up of the flower. Unfortunately, at Kaimaumau, we had a large fire which burnt for nearly 40 days, I believe, over the December-January period of this year. There had been smaller fires in the area over the past 2 or 3 decades that have only lasted 2, 3, 4 days, and areas where Cryptostylis had been found have been burnt over in these fires, and the plants have recovered quite nicely. Whether they're going to be able to do so after the extensive fire that we had this year is something that's going to be of interest over the next few years. Fingers crossed that it does still survive in the area. Also up in there is Thelymitra malvina, and it's got a fairly wide distribution. Again, it's in the lowland lakes that are found in the area of Northland. And again, growing in very similar conditions to the Cryptostylis as well. And you can see there the purple cilia that gives it its specific name of malvina. Now we come to an interesting plant. It's a Taeniophyllum that was originally found in New Zealand back about 1998. growing on gorse. Now you can see the collection dot there for up in the North Island, and I've had to download all of the Taeniophyllum species found on the virtual herbarium, because initially it had been thought or described as Taeniophyllum norfolkianum, and you can see how far north of New Zealand the Norfolk Island is. You can see that there are a couple of collections towards the northern New South Wales, sort of southern Queensland, which may be where it's come from as well. As I said, it was originally named as Norfolkianum. Subsequently, it has been named as Taeniophyllum northlandicum. And here is a picture of a plant from the original discovery where it was growing on gorse. And here is one that was found in a second location further north up towards Kaitaia here, in this area here. And it was interesting, it was actually found growing on Feijoa and magnolia trees. And I was reading in the New Zealand Native Orchid Journal that there's been discussion with one of the people involved with the naming of it, that this plant actually may be related to a currently undescribed species found in New South Wales. So possibly for a second time, an Australian origining orchid has been named here in New Zealand first. Of interest to me, because it's close to my stamping ground, is Chiloglottis trapeziformis. As you can see here, there are a lot of sites over in Australia. Nothing showing up in the distribution map for the herbarium though. But in the late 1990s, a population of trapeziformis was found in a pine plantation at Hokio, which is where that X is at the moment on that map. And the X is there because that plantation was actually felled. Some of the plants were rescued and taken up to Iwatahi, where they grew, but not very successfully. And when they were having problems with pigs and possums browsing on some of the orchids, one of the things they tried out was putting stainless steel cages over some of the orchids to protect them, not realizing that the soils there would cause the zinc in the galvanized steel. And the zinc galvanizing actually leached off of the cages and started killing some of the orchids through zinc toxicity. However, some plants were put into a recreational park a bit further north from the original location, and they are growing quite nicely there, ticking over. And 2 years ago, a large colony was found in a newish plantation which was about 30 years old. And we're not sure if this has originated from the same event that brought the plants over initially to Hokio, whether it's a secondary event or whether somebody had managed to collect some more plants and planted in this area, and the plants have really loved it and they have taken off. The colonies there cover a area of about 100 square meters in a couple of patches, and in the reserve at Waikanae, one of the patches covers an area of about 15 square meters, and the other one that is in the area is about 5 square meters. They do seem to be slowly increasing, but not at a great rate. And I think that they may sort of go in fits and starts and sort of shrink back again at times. This is the conditions that they're growing in the pine mulch. And here's a nice photo of them. One of the more recent arrivals is Pterostylis alveata, which was first recognized here in New Zealand in the early 2000s at the top of the South Island near Collingwood. There is a suggestion that these may have come across in one of the bushfire events that occurred in the early 2000s. Now, as I said, you can see the Collingwood collection that was lodged with the herbarium here in New Zealand and picked up by the AVH. There is evidence of spread again westward across into the Wellington area, close to where I live. It has been found there, and I believe there have been intermediate populations found in Golden Bay as well. And a close up again of the flower. Now, one of our tragedies in some respects is Chiloglottis formicifera. It was collected by the Matthews again in the early 1910s around the Kaitaia area. And unfortunately, not only was it collected, it was over collected by the botanists. There are herbarium sheets down at the Auckland War Museum with 20 or more flower spikes of formicifera on them, and sheets were also sent down to other herbariums in New Zealand and also, I believe, across to Australia. And because of the over collection, and possibly also because of the lack of pollinators here in New Zealand, the population very quickly died out. And so this is one that we keep an eye out on, and maybe one day it will return. And I'd just like to finish by thanking the following people who have kindly made their photos available through the Creative Commons protocol and allowed me to share these with you.